The throne room of the alien queen was vast, its walls shimmering with an ethereal glow, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the cold, metal floor. Towering spires of obsidian rose from the ground like jagged teeth, while the ceiling disappeared into darkness, swallowed by the unnatural height. It was here that the queen of the Zelanar stood, her regal figure casting an imposing silhouette against the stars visible through the massive windows. Her eyes, sharp as obsidian, surveyed the gathered assembly of her generals and closest advisors. A silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of her presence. She raised a single hand, and at once the murmurs faded. The room became still. "I have made my decision," Queen Zelare announced, her voice a low, resonant hum that reverberated through the chamber. "A duel. A human will face our greatest warrior." Her gaze swept across the room, challenging anyone to speak against her command. The flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of her closest aides was fleeting. None dared to voice opposition. For the Zelanar, war had been a constant companion for millennia. Their empire, vast and merciless, had conquered world after world, each conquest marking the fall of another civilization beneath their boots. Their warriors were legends, strong, fast, and ruthless. Yet, the queen's voice carried more than just the weight of her words. It was the weight of her conviction. She had watched her people grow complacent, their victories turning into arrogance. And arrogance, she knew, was dangerous. A challenge was needed, a trial of strength and will, one that would remind her people that their supremacy was not guaranteed. They had crushed countless civilizations, but this species had intrigued her. She had studied their history, their tenacity, and their capacity for survival in the face of impossible odds. The Zelanar had never fought a species quite like them. And now, a human would face her finest champion. In the shadows of the throne room, two figures exchanged glances. One human, one alien. The human was tall, his dark brown hair tousled from the travel, his eyes fixed ahead with a calmness that betrayed nothing of the tumultuous thoughts racing in his mind. He was Marcus Kane, Earth's best duelist, selected by his superiors for this mission. He had fought in countless battles, survived wars and skirmishes, and defeated some of the galaxy's most dangerous adversaries. But nothing in his past had prepared him for the challenge ahead. His every instinct screamed that this would be different. Standing beside him was Commander Ska, the alien officer tasked with overseeing the duel. Ska was a towering figure, her silvery skin gleaming under the artificial lights, her eyes narrow with a cold intelligence that Marcus had learned to trust over their brief alliance. She was Zelanar, and she had never met a human quite like him. She had heard the stories of Earth's warriors, but until now, they had seemed like fables, nothing more than myth. She was curious, though, about how this human would fare. Would he live up to the stories? Or would he fall, as they all expected? "The Queen's decision is final," Ska spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You will face the champion. A single combat, to the death, or until one is incapacitated. It is the way of the Zelanar." Marcus didn't flinch. He had been briefed, trained, and prepared. Yet, as the enormity of the situation settled in, the reality of it all hit him harder than he anticipated. He was not here for diplomacy or to negotiate. His mission was simple: defeat the alien champion or die trying. His mind flashed to the faces of his family back on Earth. Would they ever know what had become of him? Would they ever understand that humanity's future rested on his ability to survive this one trial? He shoved the thought away. He couldn't afford weakness now. Ska led him toward the Queen. Her pace was measured, unhurried, but Marcus felt the weight of the stairs on him. The Zelanar soldiers, their expressions unreadable, lined the walls of the chamber, their postures erect and proud. They were silent spectators, awaiting the outcome with a mix of anticipation and disdain. The Queen's gaze met Marcus's as he approached. There was no warmth in her eyes, only the cool judgment of one who had seen countless challenges come and go. Her lips curled into a faint smile, though it wasn't one of kindness. "You are bold to accept my challenge, human. I hope you will prove worthy of it." Her words were both a statement and a question, as though she were testing the very core of his resolve. "I will," Marcus replied, his voice steady, despite the rapid beating of his heart. The queen's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, studying him, weighing him. Finally, she nodded. The alien champion entered the chamber, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had heard stories, seen recordings of the creature's feats, stories of brutal strength and overwhelming speed. The warrior was towering, standing nearly 3 meters tall, its muscular frame rippling under the flickering lights. The champion's skin was a mottled gray, with sharp, angular features that almost seemed carved from stone. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, a sign of its alien physiology. It was said to be invincible, undefeated in combat for over 100 years. The queen's voice broke through the tension. "This is Ralgar, my champion. You will face him now. Show me what a human is capable of." Ralgar raised his massive arms, letting out a low growl that reverberated through the chamber. He was ready, but Marcus wasn't intimidated. He had faced tougher enemies, and he wasn't about to let fear take root now. The duel was about to begin. As the first blow rang out, the room held its breath. The stage was set, and Marcus Kane, the human duelist, was about to face the might of the Zelenar. Marcus Kane stood on the transport ship's observation deck, his eyes fixed on the distant, alien world below. It was a stark contrast to the familiar blue and green of Earth, a barren landscape of gray, craggy mountains and endless stretches of dust. The Zelenar homeworld. As the ship descended into the planet's atmosphere, Marcus felt the familiar churn in his stomach, not from fear, but from the weight of the situation. He was here, not as a diplomat, not as an ambassador, but as a weapon. He had been chosen for this mission because of his reputation, Earth's greatest duelist. A title he had never asked for, and yet one that had followed him across every battlefield. His hands were steady on the railing, but beneath the calm exterior, there was a storm brewing. A duel with a champion of the Zelenar, the most fearsome species in the galaxy, was not something that could be easily prepared for. No one knew exactly what their champion was capable of. No one had survived long enough to tell the tale. The ship jolted as it touched down, the engines hummed dying down as the bay doors opened. Marcus grabbed his gear, a combat suit fitted with both technology and the marks of countless battles, and moved swiftly down the ramp. He was greeted by a group of Zelenar soldiers, their eyes glowing with cold curiosity. They were imposing, their bodies exuding a quiet menace, but their gaze held something more, an unspoken expectation. They had seen many human soldiers, but none like him. None who had been chosen for this. None who had survived battles against species as advanced and deadly as their own. A figure approached him, smaller than the others, but no less commanding. Commander Ska, assigned to oversee the duel, stood in front of him, her silver skin gleaming in the harsh light of the landing platform. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, studied him with interest, yet there was something distant in her demeanor, a professional detachment, born of years of loyalty to her people. "Welcome, human," Ska said in her measured, melodic voice. "I trust your journey was comfortable." Marcus nodded, though his mind was miles away. "It's fine. Just get me to the queen." Ska's expression didn't change. She had heard of humans, of their strange ability to remain composed under the most trying circumstances. But what struck her now was not the fearlessness of the man before her, but something more, a quiet certainty that she couldn't quite place. It made her wary. "You will meet her soon enough," Ska replied, her tone unreadable. "But first you must be prepared. The queen has demanded that you face her champion in single combat. It is the way of our people. Do you understand this?" Marcus's gaze flickered to the towering Zelenar soldiers around him. Their presence, although intimidating, was nothing compared to what awaited in the queen's chamber. He'd been briefed. The champion was a monstrosity, a being of untold strength and agility, the pride of the Zelenar. He would be tested in ways he had never been before. But that wasn't his concern. His concern was survival, and the hope that he could return to Earth to complete his mission and live to see another sunrise. "I understand," he said simply. His voice didn't waver. Ska led him through the winding corridors of the palace, each step taking him deeper into the heart of the Zelenar Empire. The walls around him were alive with the faint hum of energy, pulsating with an otherworldly power. The architecture was unlike anything he had ever seen, a blend of organic and synthetic materials seamlessly woven together. It was both beautiful and terrifying, the very essence of alien sophistication. As they approached the Queen's chamber, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. The sheer magnitude of the situation was undeniable. He had fought in wars, survived the deadliest skirmishes on Earth and in space, but this was something else entirely. This was no ordinary fight. This was an execution waiting to happen, a test of humanity's worth before a species that considered itself invincible. "You will not have much time before the duel begins," Ska said, breaking his reverie. "Prepare yourself." Marcus nodded, feeling the straps of his combat suit tighten against his body. He adjusted his stance, ensuring everything was in place. His mind flashed back to Earth, his home, the people he loved, the life he had left behind. This was bigger than him. It wasn't just about surviving the duel. It was about proving something, proving that humanity, for all its flaws and shortcomings, was capable of standing toe-to-toe with the greatest species the universe had ever known. The doors to the Queen's chamber slid open with a hiss, revealing the grandeur of the room within. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the flickering light of strange, floating orbs illuminated the space. At the center of the room stood Queen Zelare, her presence suffocating in its intensity. She was tall and elegant, draped in flowing robes that shimmered like liquid metal. Her face, sharp and regal, was an expression of cold calculation. Her eyes, however, were the most unnerving feature, dark, predatory, as though she were seeing everything and nothing at once. "You are late," the Queen's voice echoed through the chamber, each word carrying a weight of authority. "I'm here now," Marcus said, his tone steady. The Queen's lips curved into a slight smile, but it was devoid of warmth. "Your confidence is commendable," she mused. "But you are not facing me today. You are facing something far more dangerous." Without waiting for a response, she motioned to the side, and the doors opened. A figure entered, a massive being, a Zelenar warrior unlike any Marcus had seen before. The champion stood nearly 3 meters tall, its body rippling with muscle and power. It exuded an aura of invincibility, the kind of presence that made the air feel thicker, suffocating. This was Ralgar, the Zelenar champion. The last word in combat. The unbeatable. Marcus's gaze met the champion's eyes, and he knew instantly that this was a fight unlike anything he had ever faced. There would be no quarter. There would be no mercy. The Queen's voice rang out once more. "Prepare, human. The duel begins now." The finality in her words hung in the air, and Marcus knew that his next move would define not just his fate, but the fate of humanity itself. The challenge was set, and there would be no turning back. The chamber fell into an eerie silence as Ralgar stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed the room. The alien champion's presence was overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to press in from all sides. His skin, a dull gray speckled with darker patches, gleamed faintly in the shifting light. Muscles, honed through centuries of combat, rippled beneath his toughened exterior, and his jagged, angular features gave him the appearance of something born to destroy. As he moved, his steps were slow, deliberate, and measured, each one reverberating through the floor like the pounding of a drum. The ground seemed to tremble under the weight of his enormous body, as though even the palace itself feared him. His eyes, 2 glowing pools of violet, swept over the room, landing on Marcus. The human felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow, an unspoken challenge that carried centuries of arrogance and supremacy. Ralgar was not merely a warrior. He was a living legend, the culmination of the Zelenar's obsession with combat. His rise to power had been swift, brutal, and without mercy. Stories of his victories filled the halls of the Zelenar Empire, whispered in awe by soldiers and civilians alike. He had defeated whole armies, torn apart enemies with ease, and struck fear into the hearts of anyone who dared to face him. To the Zelenar, he was perfection in its purest form, a warrior who had never known defeat. His reputation was not built on just physical prowess, though. Ralgar was a strategist, a tactician whose mind was as sharp as his sword. He knew how to dismantle his opponents both physically and mentally, wearing them down before striking the killing blow. To the Zelenar, his victory was inevitable, a matter of fate. No human could possibly stand against him. The Queen, Zelare, regarded him with a mixture of admiration and possessiveness, as though Ralgar were both a tool and a treasure. She had raised him, sculpted him into the ultimate weapon, and now she watched him with a cold, calculating gaze. For all her power, her intelligence, her command over the galaxy, she was acutely aware of the one weakness she could not control: Ralgar's unpredictability. The champion was fiercely loyal, but there were whispers, rumors that his pride had grown beyond even the Queen's influence. Some feared that his invincibility had become more than just a weapon. It was a concept, a belief in his own supremacy that could, one day, challenge the very empire he fought to protect. But in this moment, the Queen trusted him completely. She was certain that no human, no matter how skilled, could stand against him. The human, Marcus Kane, stood across from Ralgar, the space between them vast, though it felt suffocating. Every instinct in Marcus screamed that he was out of his depth, that this creature, this force of nature, was too powerful to defeat. But he had been chosen for this mission because of his ability to rise above fear, to face impossible odds and survive. In the quiet before the storm, Ralgar's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. His voice, deep and resonant, cut through the silence. "You are brave, human. I will give you that." His words were heavy with disdain, as though the very concept of bravery in a creature so frail and insignificant was laughable. Marcus's jaw tightened. He had fought creatures that could tear him apart with a single swipe, and yet something about Ralgar made him feel as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice. The champion's arrogance was palpable, a poisonous aura that radiated from him like an oppressive heat. But Marcus would not be intimidated. "Not now. Not ever. I didn't come here to impress you," Marcus replied, his voice steady. He knew the stakes. This wasn't about bravado or empty threats. This was about survival. And survival meant focusing on the one thing he could control: himself. Ralgar's smile widened, though it held no humor. "Then you are even more foolish than I thought." The air in the chamber grew thick with tension, and the faintest tremor of anticipation swept through the onlookers. Zelenar's soldiers, officers, and the Queen herself. All eyes were fixed on the two combatants. The duel was about to begin, and the outcome was never in doubt. Not in the minds of the Zelenar. For the Queen, this moment was more than just a spectacle. It was a test, a demonstration of her empire's might, of the invincibility she had crafted. The human, with his small frame and fragile bones, was nothing more than an obstacle to be crushed. But what she could not see, what none of her people could see, was that Marcus Kane was not just a soldier. He was the embodiment of something far greater, a force that had defied expectations throughout history. "Begins!" The Queen's command rang out like the strike of a gong, and the entire chamber seemed to exhale in unison. Ralgar was upon him in an instant, a blur of motion as he closed the distance with terrifying speed. His massive fists were like hammers, the air crackling with the force of his strikes. Marcus barely had time to react, but instinct kicked in. He ducked low, narrowly avoiding a crushing blow that would have shattered his spine. The ground beneath him cracked from the force of the punch, sending up a cloud of dust. The champion wasted no time, following up with a swift kick aimed at Marcus's chest. But Marcus, anticipating the move, rolled to the side, the blow skimming past him and striking the stone floor with a deafening impact. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Every muscle screamed with effort, but his mind remained clear. He knew that Ralgar's strength was unmatched, but he had something the champion did not: human ingenuity. Ralgar snarled in frustration, his eyes glowing with a fierce light. He was not used to being evaded, let alone outmaneuvered. The human was quick, but speed alone would not be enough. The champion's confidence was shattered. His pride, his greatest weapon, was being pierced by this human's resilience. And for the first time in his long life, Ralgar realized that he was not invincible. But the fight was far from over. The human had evaded him once, but there was no escape from the storm Ralgar was about to unleash. The Queen's command echoed through the chamber like a death knell, signaling the start of the duel. As Ralgar charged toward him, Marcus's world narrowed to the blur of motion before him. His body responded without thinking. His legs carried him to the side, narrowly avoiding the champion's fist, which landed with an earth-shaking thud against the stone floor. The impact left a crater, cracked spiderwebbing out from the point of contact. The air hummed with the residual force, but Marcus didn't falter. His pulse pounded in his ears, a steady drumbeat that synced with the rhythm of his movements. His thoughts were sharp, focused, his body alive with adrenaline. He had trained for this moment for years, though never, not even in his darkest imaginings, had he considered facing something like Ralgar. The alien's power was unimaginable, each swing of his massive arms a threat to rip Marcus apart. But it wasn't the raw power alone that made Ralgar terrifying. It was his precision, his utter control over his strength. This wasn't a mere beast driven by instinct. This was a weapon. Marcus felt the heat of the air shift as Ralgar threw a follow-up punch, aimed at his head. The speed of the blow was almost too fast for his eyes to track, but Marcus, anticipating it, ducked low. The punch missed, and Ralgar's massive arm cleaved the air where Marcus's head had been moments before. With a twist of his hips, Marcus spun out of range, landing on his feet with the grace of a seasoned fighter. The movements were instinctual, but his mind worked just as fast, calculating, analyzing. He could now fight Ralgar, not in sheer strength, but speed, dexterity, and guile. Those were his advantages. Ralgar snarled, the sound low and guttural, full of frustration. The champion's eyes burned with the desire to crush this human, to end the fight in one devastating blow. He advanced again, this time more cautious, his steps heavier, slower. He was testing Marcus's reactions, trying to bait him into a mistake. And Marcus knew it. Every moment that passed, every breath, was a gamble. He couldn't afford a misstep. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. And in that instant, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected, something beyond the arrogance, beyond the fury. It was a flicker of doubt. It was a crack in the champion's perfect facade, a brief moment of realization that maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't as insignificant as he had first assumed. It made Ralgar hesitate, just long enough for Marcus to close the distance between them. He lunged forward, weaving under the next punch, and came up with his knee aimed at Ralgar's midsection. The blow landed, but it was like striking a mountain. Ralgar didn't flinch, though Marcus could feel the brief shift in his stance. His opponent was not invulnerable. He had limits, just like any being. Ralgar growled, stepping back and raising his arm, preparing for a crushing blow. Marcus, heart racing, sidestepped once more, narrowly dodging another strike. His chest burned with exertion, sweat dripping down his brow, but he didn't stop. His mind was clear, focusing on the fight, on the steps ahead. Every movement was measured, every breath controlled. He wasn't going to win this with brute force, but he wasn't going to lose either. Ralgar's rage seemed to grow with every failed strike. His confidence was beginning to falter, the cracks in his arrogance widening. Marcus's refusal to fall under the weight of his blows was something Ralgar couldn't ignore. He was used to breaking his enemies in seconds, not being danced around like a child. This human, for all his shortcomings, was proving to be more than just a test of strength. Marcus moved quickly again, ducking under another punch, but this time, he shifted his weight, sliding behind Ralgar. In one smooth motion, he brought his fist up toward the champion's exposed ribs, but the blow never connected. With a speed that was almost impossible to track, Ralgar spun on his heel, his elbow coming crashing into Marcus's ribs. The force of the impact left Marcus gasping for air, pain radiating through his chest like fire. He staggered, but he didn't fall. He couldn't afford to fall. Gritting his teeth, Marcus recovered, pressing his hand to his side. His ribs were on fire, but there was no time to dwell on the injury. He had to keep moving, keep attacking. The room was spinning slightly from the force of the hit, but his vision cleared quickly. He could feel the faintest tremor in his limbs from the exertion, but it was a reminder that he was still alive. He still had a chance. Ralgar loomed in front of him. The champion's expression twisted into something that could only be described as contemptuous amusement. "You fight well for a human," Ralgar grunted, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "But you're nothing. You cannot win." Marcus's breath came in short bursts, but he kept his eyes locked on Ralgar's, the fire in his chest burning brighter than ever. "I'm not here to win," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "I'm here to make sure you remember me." The words hit Ralgar like a slap. There was no grand speech, no threats of vengeance. It wasn't the bravado that Marcus was known for. It was a quiet, defiant truth. The champion's eyes flashed with something he hadn't expected, a flicker of respect, perhaps, or maybe confusion. But that moment of uncertainty was all Marcus needed. In one fluid motion, he ducked under another heavy punch, using the momentum to slip behind Ralgar once more. This time, he was ready. Marcus reached for a concealed blade tucked inside his combat suit, a small, razor-sharp edge designed for quick, precise strikes. He drove it into the gap between Ralgar's armored plates, aiming for the soft spot in the champion's side. The blade sank deep, and Ralgar roared in pain, his body jerking as though struck by lightning. The air was thick with the sound of his fury, but Marcus didn't relent. He twisted the blade, driving it deeper, forcing the champion to stagger forward, off balance. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The queen's gaze never left the combat, her eyes calculating, watching her champion falter. The ground beneath them trembled as Ralgar recovered, but Marcus had made his mark. The duel was no longer just about survival. It was about proving that even the mightiest could bleed. Ralgar's roar of rage shook the walls, but Marcus had already stepped back, preparing for the next round. The chamber shook with Ralgar's fury, his massive form stumbling, but it was clear Marcus had struck a blow. The champion's breathing came in heavy, guttural gasps as he staggered, his side leaking dark, viscous fluid from the deep gash where Marcus's blade had pierced him. For a moment, Ralgar's proud face twisted with something like disbelief, a rare crack in his invincible demeanor. Marcus stood at the ready, every muscle aching, his breath shallow and strained. His ribs burned with the bruising impact of Ralgar's last blow, but he could taste something sweeter than blood now. Hope. He had done it. He had made the champion bleed. Ralgar roared, a sound like the growl of a beast cornered. But there was more now than just rage. There was frustration. The unstoppable force of the Zelanar champion was faltering, and Marcus was still standing. The human had pushed him to the limit, and for the first time, Marcus could see that the fight wasn't just about strength. It was about will, about resilience. Ralgar's arrogance, once an unshakable foundation, was crumbling under the weight of Marcus's determination. The alien warrior lunged again, faster than Marcus could track, but this time, there was hesitation. Ralgar's moves were a little slower, his eyes more frantic. The pain from the wound was affecting him, and the realization hit Marcus like a jolt of electricity. The champion wasn't invulnerable. He had limits. Marcus ducked under a sweeping strike, feeling the air rush by as Ralgar's arm missed by inches. The champion had already started his follow-up, but Marcus was ready. He had studied Ralgar's movements, knew the pattern. The Zelanar champion was built for brute strength, but Marcus had learned to outmaneuver that, to use it against him. As Ralgar's left fist crashed forward, Marcus sidestepped with all the precision he could muster. He had one shot. With a burst of adrenaline, Marcus darted forward, dodging Ralgar's outstretched arm and diving beneath the champion's massive torso. There was no time to think, no time to second-guess. His hand closed around the hilt of his blade again, and he thrust it upward with everything he had left. The steel slipped between the champion's ribs, past the thick armor of muscle and bone, aiming directly for the heart. Ralgar's scream was a sound of fury and shock, a bellow so powerful it vibrated the very stones beneath their feet. The champion's massive frame stiffened, his glowing violet eyes wide with the realization that he was vulnerable after all. The world seemed to pause in that heartbeat. Marcus's strike had found its mark. For a long moment, there was only silence. The only sound was the labored breathing of the two combatants, the echo of Marcus's pounding heart in his ears. Then, with a final, ragged exhalation, Ralgar crumpled. His great body collapsed to the floor, the impact sending a wave of dust into the air. The sound was deafening, as though the universe itself had held its breath and now exhaled in one great shudder. Marcus stood over the fallen champion, his chest heaving, the blade still lodged in Ralgar's side. The champion's eyes flickered one last time, glowing faintly with the last remnants of his life force. But it was over. The human had done the impossible. He had defeated Ralgar, the pride of the Zelaar. The silence in the room was deafening. The onlookers, Zelaar soldiers, commanders, even the queen herself, stood frozen, as if they, too, were trying to comprehend the impossible. The Zelaar had never lost a duel like this. Never. But here was Marcus Kane, breathing heavily, standing victorious over their greatest warrior. A human, a creature they had written off as weak, insignificant. Yet it was a human who had defeated their champion. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, as if the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in, the queen stepped forward. Her eyes, cold and unyielding, fixed on Marcus. There was no rage in them, only a calculating, almost fascinated stare. "You have done what no one else could," she said, her voice distant, almost mechanical. "But know this, human, you are not a hero. You are a tool, a pawn in the game we play." Her words were measured, devoid of emotion. There was no admiration in her gaze, only cold, hard acknowledgement. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew that the queen, in her vast, alien wisdom, would never understand the true nature of his victory. She would never see the human spirit, the unrelenting drive, the refusal to be cowed by impossible odds. To her, this was just a moment in a larger, unsolvable puzzle. But to Marcus, this was everything. It wasn't just about defeating Ralgar. It was about proving that humans could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest warriors in the galaxy and not be crushed. The queen stepped closer, her regal presence filling the room like a dark cloud. "You have broken our champion," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "But do not think for a moment that this means you have won. You may have won the fight, but the war has only just begun." Marcus stood tall, despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on his body. His limbs were sore, his vision blurry, but he refused to show weakness. He had come to this planet not for glory or fame, but for survival, for the survival of Earth and its people. His eyes met the queen's, unwavering. "I didn't come for a war," Marcus said, his voice hoarse but strong. "I came to show you that you underestimated humanity. And that was your mistake." The queen's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, a flicker of something almost resembling respect crossing her cold features. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar coldness of the ruler of the Zelaar. She turned her gaze to her fallen champion, then back to Marcus, and for the first time, she nodded, slowly, as if to acknowledge that the human had earned his place in this galaxy. For now, the battle was won. But Marcus knew that the war, the true test, had just begun. The chamber was still. The echo of Ralgar's fall had faded, leaving only the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Marcus Kane and the distant hum of the queen's watchful gaze. His body ached, bruised and battered from the brutal exchange, but his mind was alive with the pulse of victory, a victory that no one had expected. The weight of the moment pressed on him, but Marcus refused to let it crush him. His legs were shaky, but he stood tall, unyielding in the face of the unknown that lay ahead. The queen's words lingered in the air like a cold wind, her voice sharp, calculating. She had acknowledged his triumph, but there was no honor in her tone, no sign of admiration. To her, this was merely a step in the dance of power, a shift in the balance of a game she had been playing for centuries. Marcus knew that this victory, while sweet, was just the beginning of something much larger. The silence stretched on, thick with the unspoken weight of what had just transpired. Marcus's eyes scanned the room, taking in the stillness of the Zelenar warriors who had gathered to witness the duel. Their expressions were unreadable, the aliens' stoic faces betraying nothing of their thoughts. Some were in shock, others perhaps in fear, but none dared to challenge what had just happened. None dared to question the outcome, for Ralgar, the pride of their species, had been brought low by a human. Marcus's heart still hammered in his chest, the rush of adrenaline slowly fading into exhaustion. His muscles screamed, his vision blurred at the edges, but he kept his stance steady. He had faced the impossible and won. The alien warriors in the room would remember his name, even if the Queen herself chose to dismiss him as nothing more than a tool. The Queen's gaze never wavered from him, her eyes cold and unblinking. She stepped forward slowly, her movement smooth and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. She stopped a few feet from Marcus, her presence suffocating, the weight of her authority pressing against him. There was no trace of emotion in her face, no warmth or recognition. To her, he was an anomaly, a glitch in the system that she had yet to fully process. "You have proven yourself," the Queen said, her voice smooth as silk but edged with something darker. "But do not mistake this for mercy. You are still a tool in my game. And the game, as you have seen, is far from over." Marcus's lips curled into a faint, tired smile. He was not naive enough to believe that this moment would change the Queen's view of him. He knew the truth of her words. He was nothing but a pawn in her eyes. But that didn't matter. The victory was his. He had shown them something they hadn't considered, that humanity could survive in a world that sought to destroy it, that they could stand against the Zelenar and not be crushed. "Mercy?" Marcus repeated, his voice hoarse but steady. "I didn't expect mercy. I just wanted you to see what we're capable of." The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips barely twitching at the edges. She was thinking, calculating, assessing him in ways that only someone of her immense intellect could. But Marcus stood firm, even as his body begged for rest, even as the exhaustion began to set in. He had earned this moment. He had earned the right to stand before her without fear. "You will be useful to me," the Queen finally said, her voice like a blade cutting through the tension. "But know this, human, this victory of yours will not go unpunished. You will face more challenges. You will be tested. And when you fail," her gaze hardened, her words cold and final, "I will not show you mercy." Marcus met her gaze without flinching, a quiet determination in his eyes. "Then I'll fight through every test you throw at me. I'll survive. You'll see." The Queen studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her presence fading like a shadow into the distance. The alien warriors, still standing in rigid silence, followed her lead, filing out of the chamber one by one. The tension that had filled the room slowly dissipated, leaving Marcus alone with the lifeless body of Ralgar and the weight of what had just occurred. The victory was his, but it was bittersweet. He had beaten Ralgar, yes, but that was only the beginning. The Queen had made it clear that his survival was not guaranteed. There would be more tests, more battles, and he would be forced to prove himself again and again. But for the first time in his life, Marcus felt something that he had never experienced before. The certainty that he was capable of more, that he could face the impossible and come out on top. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and turned his attention to Ralgar's fallen body. The champion, once a symbol of the Zelenar's might, now lay defeated at his feet. It was a powerful reminder of what one could accomplish when pushed beyond their limits. Marcus knew that this victory would not only reshape the way the Zelenar viewed humanity, it would shape him, too. There was still a long road ahead, but for now, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had fought, and he had won. And as the sounds of the chamber faded into the distance, he knew that no matter what came next, he would be ready. The war had only just begun, and he was prepared to fight every step of the way. The Queen's voice echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder of what awaited him. But Marcus Kane had already made up his mind. He would survive, and this time he would make sure that humanity was never underestimated again.